Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here. Again, I'm Lois Woods, and I'm a graduate of Walden, and I'm happy to be here for my first presentation today. I'm currently a criminal investigator for the district attorney in the Clayton Judicial Circuit in Georgia. I am also criminal justice adjunct faculty at Georgia Piedmont Tech and American Intercontinental University. And I am honored to be here today among mentors and students and all of you who are interested in the criminal justice system. Next slide, please. Before I delve into the presentation, I'd like to give you just a brief review of zero tolerance discipline and the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. Zero tolerance discipline has been defined as school discipline policies and practices that dictate predetermined punitive penalties such as suspensions or expulsions for specific student behavior, regardless of the situation or rationale for the behavior. Research has further indicated that the upsurge in in-school arrests is the direct result of the growth of police presence on school campuses and has given rise to an increase in student contact with the criminal justice system, thus fueling the school to prison pipeline phenomena. Currently, these strategies remain in place in school districts throughout the nation. However, according to a comprehensive study by Smith and Harper back in 2015, the disparate and disproportionate impact of zero tolerance discipline is particularly pronounced in the South. The Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, which will be referred to as JDAI throughout the presentation, is an initiative developed by the Annie E. Casey Foundation as a nationwide effort of local and state juvenile justice agencies in response to the growing number of youths being held in secure detention across the United States for nonviolent acts. Next slide, please. So the purpose of my non-experimental quantitative study was to examine the relationships between JDAI status, zero tolerance-based arrests, and referrals of students, with JDAI status, race, gender, and age as the independent variables, and arrest and referrals as the dependent variables. All the data were analyzed with binary logistic regression to test the hypotheses. Next slide, please. So my study's research question was, does JDAI status predict arrest and referral while controlling for race, gender, and age? This research question was derived from the review of existing literature pertaining to zero tolerance and JDAI, and allowed me to develop hypotheses that define the research variables as well as the method of measurement for testing. So I went with two binary logistic regressions to analyze the data. Next slide, please. Secondary data were collected on a sample drawn from middle school students from a juvenile court in the Northwest jurisdiction in Georgia. This population of students was of interest to me because empirical studies have shown middle schoolers are at a vulnerable age in their development and are prone to higher incidence of discipline. And therefore, I chose to sample students aged between 12 and 14 years old. I chose to use homogeneous sampling for the following reasons. First, the sample focused on candidates who shared similar characteristics of being arrested or referred as a result of zero tolerance school discipline. Second, the jurisdiction was in a state with a documented practice of disproportionate exclusionary discipline. Third, the jurisdiction had a total of 18 middle schools, which provided an adequate sample size. And fourth, the jurisdiction was a fully operational JDAI site. Next slide, please. So I was able to obtain aggregate data for the 2-year period, 2001 to 2002, which was prior to the implementation of the JDAI School Reduction Referral Program, and the 2-year period, 2017 to 2018, which was post-JDAI. The data received from the juvenile court consisted of 1,364 cases. However, 61 or 4.4% of those cases were omitted based on the student's race. Cases where students were listed as either Hispanic, Asian, other, or unknown were removed from the data to conform to the purpose and direction of my study. After removing those cases, the sample size resulted in 1,303 cases, which reflected Black and white, male and female middle school students who were 12 to 14 years of age and who were either arrested or referred to the juvenile justice system as a result of zero tolerance discipline. To address my research question, like I said, two binary logistic regression equations were constructed to determine the likelihood of JDAI status on arrests and referrals while controlling for race, age, and gender. And these objectives were answered in the following two subsections as JDAI arrests and JDAI referrals. Next slide, please. The logistic regression model was statistically significant. The model correctly classified 89% of the cases. And of the 4 predictive variables, only gender and age were significant contributors to the model. Race did not add any significant contribution to the model, and the predictive variable JDAI did not add any additional contribution to the model as well. However, findings from the model indicated male students had 2.09 times higher odds of being arrested than female students, and for each unit reduction in age, the odds of being arrested increased by a factor of 1.38. Next slide, please. The logistic regression model was for referrals and also correctly classified 89% of the cases. And like the arrest model, of the 4 predictive variables, only gender and age were significant contributors to the model. Again, race did not add any significant contribution to the model. And here, female students had 2.09 times higher odds of being referred than male students, which mirrors the arrest model. And for each unit decrease in age, the odds of being referred were increased by a factor of 1.33. Next slide, please. The abundance of literature depicting how zero tolerance discipline serves as the impetus for the school to prison pipeline and was the motivation for my study. In 2017, Owens asserted student contact with the criminal justice system has increased exponentially as law enforcement replaced discipline to address student misbehavior. And according to that comprehensive APA Zero Tolerance Task Force done back in 2008, and several other studies done by Burrick and Curran, these exclusionary discipline strategies have been particularly damaging to Black male students who are suspended and expelled 3 times more than white students. Other studies conducted argued that these suspensions and expulsions decrease the educational and employment opportunities for Black males while increasing the likelihood of incarceration. And according to a recent study in 2020, nearly 70% of the US's imprisoned population did not complete high school, and a substantial portion of that percentage can be contributed to years of zero tolerance discipline policies. Next slide, please. So participants in the study, like I said, included 1,303 Black and white middle school students from a jurisdiction in Georgia, Northwest Georgia, who were arrested and referred and subsequently detained by the juvenile justice system. Although the study revealed race was not a significant predictor of arrests and referrals, findings demonstrated that Black students were 89.4% of those arrested or referred, compared to white students accounting for 10.6%. These results support recent research that found Black middle school children are disproportionately subjected to zero tolerance discipline and the school to prison pipeline. The results in the study indicated gender was a significant predictor for arrests and referrals, and these findings also coincided with the literature. The results for gender showed 68.5% of students arrested or referred as a result of zero tolerance discipline were male, while female students, according to the study, accounted for 31.5% of cases of arrests and referrals. And these findings are also similar to studies conducted by Barnes and Motts and the Government Accountability Office that reported male students as a group are overrepresented when it comes to school discipline. The findings for age, which also significantly predicted arrest and referrals, parallel the literature as well, as data from the study found 29% of students arrested or referred to the juvenile court were 12 years of age. However, as students' age increased, so did the number of arrests and referrals. 13-year-old students represented 30.65% of arrests and referrals, while 34.2% of the students arrested and referred were 14 years of age. And these findings also align with Owen's 2017 study that found that the majority of students arrested at school were under the age of 15 years old. Next slide, please. So this study's findings also support and extend the knowledge of looking at juvenile justice through the lenses of stage environment fit theory and labeling theory. Stage environment fit theory asserted middle school poses a mismatch between student stage of development and the middle school environment, and this lack of fit can cause students to become detached and unmotivated. This study sampled middle school students, like I said, between the ages of 12 and 14 years old, who, according to stage environment fit theory, are at the most vulnerable stage of their development and are prone to challenge authority. This study's findings also affirm the rationale of examining middle school students' arrests and referrals through labeling theory. Labeling theorists contended the label of deviance is applied to individuals who allegedly violate social norms. And the alienation from society and deviance of being rejected advances this delinquent behavior. Thus, research conducted by Kennedy, Lewis, and Murphy in 2016 and several others all found that students who were labeled as lower achievers and deviant, or those who have special educational needs, are prone to negatively respond to this type of learning environment and will either misbehave or disengage from the educational process altogether. Relative to labeling theory, this study found that of the 1,303 students who were arrested and referred to juvenile court, 1,165, or 89.4% of those students, were Black. These findings further support the recent literature that proposed labels placed on students by educators may be influenced by their implicit biases and is reflected in how they administer discipline. Next slide, please. So there are a few limitations of the study worth noting. First, the study was limited geographically to one region in Georgia. And given that most educational and criminal justice policies are local, what applies to the study population may not be applicable to other regions or states or national policies. Also, the study's non-experimental quantitative design may not have explicitly reflected underlying elements of the evaluation of the JDAI program's effects on student arrest and referrals. Another limitation was that there was not a standard framework how and when they were applied and what were the accountability measures in applying these policies. Next slide, please. Additionally, how the data was requested may have limited the scope of the study. Originally, data was requested for 2 years prior to the implementation of JDAI and the 2 most recent years of data after the program's implementation. Perhaps the study would have, if the study contained more depth of all the years of the data for the program between those 4 years, maybe it would have had a different outcome or other developments. These limitations taken collectively can affect generalizing how discipline is interpreted and meted out in other school districts, or how juveniles are processed within the judicial system for states and other regions of the country. Next slide, please. Based on the study's findings, it is recommended a longitudinal study be conducted on school districts in those southern states where the disproportionate number of Black students are subjected to exclusionary discipline. It is recommended such a study explore the long-term efficacy of detention alternatives that in these jurisdictions to determine if any systemic changes have been implemented to curb Black student contact with the criminal justice system. Also, further research of a qualitative nature, perhaps, on JDAI school reduction referral program is needed to determine the perception of its efficacy by teachers, administrators, and school resource officers. The findings of this type of study may offer insight into whether or not factors such as teacher and officer implicit biases are actually being identified and addressed. And finally, this study, like so many others, indicated Black males are overrepresented in the school to prison pipeline. However, Black females are often overlooked in discussions of zero tolerance discipline, even though it has been reported they are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white females and 1.5 times more likely to be suspended than white males. Black females are subjected to the disparate and disproportionate zero tolerance discipline policies and are also being funneled through the school to prison pipeline. More research is recommended to examine the long-term psychological and socioeconomic impact of these practices on this underreported population. Next slide, please. The theoretical findings of this study contributed to the literature on zero tolerance discipline and juvenile justice reform by explaining how stage environment fit and labeling theories are intrinsic to reforming the practice of zero tolerance discipline and the school to prison pipeline. This information is necessary for stakeholders involved in education and juvenile justice reform and can serve to guide decisions on policies and programs that promote positive social change that will improve the life outcomes of marginalized students. Furthermore, this information is meant to encourage honest conversations about the biases that are at the root of the subjective and disparate disciplinary practices that funnel Black students through the school to prison pipeline. The effects of positive social change will be reflected in students' success and can be measured by an increase in graduation rates, the narrowing of the academic achievement gap, and the decrease in the number of Black students' contact with the criminal justice system. Next slide, please. So again, the purpose of the study was to examine the efficacy of JDAI on zero tolerance related arrests and referrals. Several of the study's findings supported the need for policy and decision makers to take a look at the merits of JDAI or similar programs that promote alternatives to juvenile detention that are cost effective and allows all children the opportunity to achieve a quality education, thereby improving their chances for positive life outcomes. As I mentioned, I'm in Georgia, and although Georgia legislators implemented sweeping juvenile justice reform back in 2013 with the passing of House Bill 242, which required all judicial circuits to implement juvenile detention alternatives, more effort and more research are needed to address the systemic socioeconomic and racial biases that exist in our schools and criminal justice system that are at the core of zero tolerance and the criminalization of youth misbehavior. Change must begin in our schools, which can no longer be an extension of our criminal justice system. Change must begin in our schools, and there must also be change in the training and hiring practices of school administrators, teachers, and counselors, and school resource officers that require racial implicit bias training and education. It is only then that honest conversations can take place to positively affect change that will dismantle zero tolerance and exclusionary discipline practices that derail the school to prison and derail the school to prison pipeline. Next slide, please. Thank you for your time and attention. And if there's any time left, I could take a few questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woods. We do have about 3 or 4 minutes left, and I think that everybody would be willing to give you a couple of extra minutes since we have 10 minutes between sessions, given some of the hiccups that we had in starting a bit late. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat while we're waiting for some folks to maybe ask some questions or post some of their thoughts. We do have a question from Justice Graves about if there is the ability to get a direct link to the study.
Sure, I can make that available.
Okay, great. You can send it to us and we can make it available with the recording, but possibly. Wonderful. You're getting some nice kudos about great information, and thanking you
Thank
so
you.
much. We do have a question from Michelle Miller. Dr. Woods, have you heard of Louisiana's harshest juvenile lockup? If you have,
Yes.
how do you think this can be revamped?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that is mentioned in my study, in my dissertation. I did mention that, and I was horrified when I researched it. But that's a good question. How can we change it? I with us, with you all, and I think that we have to be steadfast. And like I said, we have to have honest conversations. We have to have these honest conversations, and we have to acknowledge that it's happening, and we just have to call people to task. And if they don't make those changes, we have to figure out how to either remove them from their positions, either by voting or anything else. But we have to keep moving forward, because I mean, this is 2022, and you know, the keynote speaker this morning, which was excellent. You know, several of us asked questions about, you know, what do we do? And if you look at it, it's almost like, you know, it's true that old adage, history repeats itself. Well, so here we go again. But I throw the question back to you. I mean, what do you suggest we do? Because we're doing the research, we're doing the seminars, we're putting stuff out there, we're studying criminal justice, we're acknowledging it. How do we get others to acknowledge it and make that change?
Thank you, Dr. Woods. I received a question that I'm not sure was meant to go to you or to everybody, about the process to become a criminal investigator.
You can send me that email.
Okay.
You can send me that question to my email.
Okay, great.
And I'll address it with you. No problem.
Okay, perfect. We do thank you all so much for joining us. We do hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium this afternoon.